Hello, we are at noon, so gonna get started. See a couple people trickling in still, but that's all right. Thank you for coming out today. I believe this is the last programming session for this leg of the Common Read. Um, and we are lucky to welcome the editors of Grand Rapids Grassroots and Anthology, our text for the campus common reading. Here today we have Dr. Ashley Nickels and Dani Vilella. And they're going to give us some thoughts about what it was like putting together the book, some thoughts on activism and all the themes we've been talking about with the Common Read so far this year.
All right, so you probably want me to use this. So I'm going to go ahead and go first. I'm Ashley. And the way that we have organized this is one, very informal. So if you've read the book, this is very much our style, which is informal storytelling. So we figured it is the most authentic to do informal storytelling as an introduction to the work that we've been doing. So I'll tell you a little bit about myself. It's a little weird, I'll be honest, because the intro to the book is a little bit about myself. But if you haven't read the intro, I'll give away some of it. And then Danielle's gonna go, and then we'll talk a little bit about the process of like how we even did this. So I'm Ashley Nickels. I am a professor at Kent State University. Um, and so I live in Ohio. I live in Cleveland, and was incredibly shocked, surprised, honored, all the words when Sophia reached out and said, "Hey, Grand Rapids Community College wants to use your book as the campus common read," and I'm still sitting here in a little bit of shock. So a little bit about me though. I'm originally from Grand Rapids. So it's not an Ohioan who parachuted into Grand Rapids and was just randomly decided that I would this together. But I was born and raised here, and I left when I was 30. So the first 30 years of my life was in Grand Rapids. And if you want to go really far back, I can tell you my elementary schools were Ken O'Shea and Sherwood Park. So Southeast Side Grand Rapidians. And we've known each other since we were 8. And so
Which is 20 years.
yeah, it was just a couple years ago. Yeah. um, and so by way of introduction in terms of who I am and kind of the quote unquote qualifications for putting this together, there's the academic side of the work that I do. And so I have a PhD in public affairs with a specialization in community development. And my work really focuses on things like civic power and urban politics and community activism and the power of storytelling. So how storytelling can create change. And so I spent a lot of time thinking about that. And my non-academic credentials are that I lived here. I was a professional at Grand Valley State for 6 years before deciding to leave the state of Michigan to go pursue my PhD and do all the academic stuff, but I worked in community. So I worked with the Kent County Domestic Violence Task Force. I worked with the sexual assault awareness programs. I worked as a volunteer with the domestic violence shelters. I was the president of the National Organization for Women. There's a theme here. You're going to hear this theme. It was part of who I saw myself as, which was a community activist that really felt connected to this space and wanted to make this space everything that it could be. And so, I mean, those are kind of the background to who I am and why we put this together. And I'll pass it off to Danielle to tell a little bit more about kind of her story and before I kind of go into the nitty gritty details of how this book itself came to be.
Hi, I hate microphones. I'm always either too loud or I start to whisper. So if I'm blowing out your ears, I apologize. Hi, I'm Dani Vilella. Ashley's known me since we were 8, so she calls me Danielle. So does my mother. You don't. I'm Dani. Um, um, for me, I'm also a lifelong Grand Rapidian. I grew up here, same elementary school, and I really wanted out. I majored in anthropology in college, and my dream was to get out of here and never come back. Um, and as I grew up and started working in the community and started being more part of the community, I kept getting more and more embedded in the activist community here in my early 20s. And I had been a bit of a rabble rouser when I was younger than that in my teens, but I never meant to do it here. Um, I was going to go change the world, but somewhere else, like way away. And I started working in the nonprofit world here and worked at Planned Parenthood for 13 years. Started at the local office, and I was their community organizer and then eventually their field and political director. And so I went sort of from a hyper local reproductive justice focus to a statewide and national reproductive justice focus in the years between 2010 and 2022. So if anybody remembers what was going on then, it was a hell of a decade for reproductive justice work. And the more I got involved in that, the more I was able to be connected with other people in this particular community that were doing all sorts of justice work. And I ended up also being the president of the National Organization for Women. I worked at the Fountain Street Church Choice Fund and a whole bunch of other projects that we did over those years, the Stop the War on Women rallies and all of that. It became more and more important to change here and to create and spaces for activism in my city and in my home and with the people that were living here. And 45 years later, I'm still here. Um, I left Planned Parenthood, like I said, about 6 years ago now, 5 years ago now. And I've been doing political work in other ways since then, but really needed to step out of the candidate side of politics. Needed to be done with that work for a while. And now I'm here raising a daughter here and trying to encourage her in that same work and find new ways in this community to create community and create connections with people that have new cool projects that they want to work on. Um, yeah.
All right, so I have the honor of telling a little bit of the story about how this book came to be. And I have the honor, I say, because like so many things that two people who have known each other for a very long time kind of deal with is one person says, I have a brilliant idea and I'm going to drag you along with me. And that's very much what happened. So um, part of why I told you a little bit about my academic background is because it's how I stumbled into the work of Belt Publishing, who's the publisher of this book, and 17 other city anthologies of Rust Belt communities across the United States. And part of how that happened is that my dissertation research was on Flint, Michigan. So I wrote a book about the takeover of Flint and the impact that the state takeover in Flint had on democracy. And I was living there in 2015, and then I went back and stayed again in 2017. So I was there pre international attention on the water crisis and then post international attention on the water crisis. And so I was able to build relationships with people throughout the city of Flint. And one of the pieces that was published by Belt Publishing is called Happy Anyway. And it's an anthology of community members from Flint. And then I remember sitting with the publisher, Ann Trubeck, at the time, because she's originally from Cleveland. It's a long story, lots of people intertwined, right? And we're sitting, and I was like, but I love Flint. I love Flint. I've written books about Flint. I've built really important connections. But all I kept coming back to was all of the stories about Michigan were Detroit and Flint, and I felt like the West Side was missing. And I feel like this happens often. If you are in Michigan and then you leave Michigan, the stories about Michigan are never about the West Side. Very rarely does Grand Rapids kind of rise to the point where people are like, let me tell a story about Grand Rapids. And if they do, it's a different type of story than the stories that I remember, or the stories that I helped create. And so I was talking to Anne, and as a really cool publisher that wants to publish stories about Rust Belt communities was like, well, then do it, right? Like, like if you want those stories to come forward, then tackle it. Put this, you do it. You don't have to wait for somebody else to do it. You can do it. So then I said, well, I'll do it with somebody, and I pulled Danielle into this. And so as we were talking and brainstorming what Grand Rapids Grassroots would be, number one, that didn't have that title at that point. It was just like, what's the story we want to tell about Grand Rapids? We're trying to really figure it out. And I'm going to leave some of that nuance to Danielle to talk about a little bit more detail. But it really was, we want to tell a story that's different than the story of the DeVosses, right? Because that's the big story. That's the name, that's if people open it up, that's where people go to, right? It's bigger than DeVos, it's bigger than Amway. We are a city that has a lot of nuance and a lot of complexity, and a lot more stories than just some big names that wind up. I think we wrote it in the intro, which is a lot of big names that wind up on buildings, right? There's more to us than that. And so when we were working with Belt, we were thinking about, all right, this is an independent publisher. It's not a traditional major academic press. How do we do this? And so we had to fundraise to make this book possible. And we did it by grassroots fundraising, which is going around to people and asking, like, do you think there's value in creating this book? And so in small chunks of money, kind of slogged along to get that.
121 people gave to this.
121 people in small amounts gave to make this a reality, right? So it really, from the very beginning, was like, how do we tell a story that's different? How do we do a book that's different? And then how do we recruit authors that can tell these different stories in ways that kind of create that complexity, that highlight the complexity of all the different ways that people come to be a part of the fabric of Grand Rapids. And so we did an open call to, using Facebook at the time, 10 years ago, as our platform to really reach out. Reaching out to many of our own networks, I think from our intro kind of gives you a sense of where our networks were. And then some specific outreach, right? So some people that we knew were doing this work. We knew we wanted to have essays. We knew we wanted to have stories. We knew we wanted to have poetry. And so but as it came together, it became so much more, I think, than we even thought it would be. And I'll be completely honest, I've been rereading and remembering all of these submissions and astounded at how many people are a part of it. And then just as a little side note, some people who continue to do just amazing work here in Grand Rapids, as well as elsewhere for the handful of people that have left. So do you want to talk a little bit about what we were what we were attempting to do and what we think we did?
So, to Ashley's point, back when we were putting this together, and we were trying to just figure out what the lane of this book would be, right? What's the angle, so to speak? How are we framing it at all? And we did. I did my master's program in nonprofit administration and civic leadership, and the big bent of the work that I was doing was on the ways that big philanthropy influences the activist and nonprofit agendas in West Michigan, and it was forefront of my brain at the time. And so we really wanted to try to tell a story that was about what was happening on the ground. Some of these stories are more grassroots than others, but they were all on the ground stories. They were all meant to talk about what people who live here were trying to do in their city, not what could get funded in the city. And so the way that we built the book, as Ashley said, the way that we reached out and got funded and so much support, like I'm still just amazed by the amount of people and who came out to support the creation of the book, was really important too. We didn't set out to write the most marketable book We didn't fulfill some call to fill a niche. We were going to create the thing that we wanted to create, and it really was Anne who was like, just do it. There's a quote that I heard recently that was, nothing is lacking, look around you, give it form. Um, and I feel like we did that with this, which is like nobody's telling these stories, and it's like, well, we can, then somebody has to. And as we were trying to reach out, we did use our networks. In fact, I was rereading some of the essays recently, and I was both really honored and surprised at how many of the different projects and stories in this book, the people that I still know are or were connected to, and then also mildly horrified at how many of the stories in this book, the people that I still know were connected to, because we really tried to do it in a broad way. We didn't try to do it in a fully comprehensive way. We knew there were going to be gaps. We wanted the people who wanted to step up and tell their stories to have a platform to do that, but we knew that that wasn't going to be everyone. This isn't a comprehensive reader of all Grand Rapids activism, right? And it is not meant to be. We also didn't want to be super prescriptive about the formatting. So, as Ashley said, like we knew we wanted storytelling to be various and varied, and we wanted the reading to be varied. It wasn't, you write us a 5,000 word essay and it needs to contain these factors and it needs to be cited sources and it needs to be this. But what we got back was super surprising. And it was a fascinating journey working with the authors. So Ash has edited a number of works like this where she's working with different authors. This was my first experience doing it. And we got a really good crash course, all of us, in there were people that we reached out to that were doing amazing things. I mean, they were the people we looked up to and was like, we want to be you when we grow up. And they came back and were like, I don't have a story to tell. I don't know what I would write. And it's like, you're the thing inspiring me. What do you mean you don't know what to write? And we worked with people who had never tried to write their stories before. They were doing great work in the world, but they'd never tried to put it on paper and needed a lot of help and a lot of handholding and encouragement to just frame their stories and figure out a way to tell them to people. And so the whole process of doing it was an act of activism in and of itself, and an act of organizing in and of itself, and all became very meta, and that was cool. Um, but in doing that, we ended up putting something out into the world that is both a snapshot in time. So, like, we are very clear about that. This was a time and a place in Grand Rapids, talking about a set of people who were sort of dominating the grassroots scene at that time. And then also that it is not everything, right? And we know that there are voices lacking, and we know that there are stories that are lacking, and we know that it has a particular bent to it because it was our networks, right? We are liberals. And we know that. So over the years, there's been, either critique of the book or questions about the book about that, and we just kind of want to say, like, we know that we're in on it, we get it. And then in terms of trying to accomplish it beyond that point, right? It really was. We are both in awe. Sophia was just telling us before that, like, there are classes here that are requiring this book to be read, and we were just like, what? That doesn't even make sense. But it's been a story, and it comes up now and again. It's still sold in bookstores here, and over the years, we've had the opportunity to run into people that have read it or were a part of it long ago that came back and were like, I published that thing and this is what came from it. Or it was because of this book that we got connected to this thing. And so that lasting impact too of what can the act of putting something in the world do in the sort of snowball effect afterwards has been extremely, extremely neat to watch. Yeah. Should we talk about
I think we're
into questions?
yeah,
Into
I think
questions?
I think all of the notes that we have determined that we would cover as we got started, we've gone over. But I also know that there are a lot of fantastic questions um, from our moderator that I want to make sure, but I don't. Oh, yeah, yeah, we can't see. Like, okay. It's like,
Are you sure I have an extra?
For the yeah.
Could you repeat the
Yeah, I will. Yeah. So the question is, we use the language of grassroots, and people are going to have different interpretations of what that means. So how are we defining it? So in terms of grassroots, the so I have a couple. I have two different answers to that, and then I'll pass it off to Dee. The first is grassroots for me is about the organic ways in which people come together to make a difference in their communities, right? So when I teach or when I'm in public, I talk about we are individuals, but we are individuals in a society, and we come together as collectives. And so what are those kind of on the ground organic ways that people come together? So from the grassroots rather than top down. And then the other part I think speaks a little bit to what Danielle was talking about as well, which is we could tell a philanthropy, nonprofit, corporate story about Grand Rapids, and I think it would be a different story. And so we really wanted to say, how do we tell a story about the communities that are doing this work, sometimes in resistance to those larger corporations, philanthropists, nonprofits, and sometimes kind of on the side. And so for me, grassroots is about both the organic, but also kind of these in between spaces.
Nailed it. Yeah. No, just to add that is yes, that is the answer to your question. But to just sort of add to it, here too, at the time we were writing this, a lot of the stories in this book are about people pushing back against the status quo power. I worked for both, like I said, a very large nonprofit industrial complex organization, and also like all volunteer radical activist organizations, like at the same time in this city doing that work. And I had the chance to really see the power that a highly funded nonprofit can bring to a space to create change, and also the places where those groups are ineffective. And For me, that was really the story of Now, the National Organization for Women, not the story of Now, and the story of Planned Parenthood work, and the complements that can happen when those things are working together. But more often, we saw in this book that people were struggling to change something that the larger system just wasn't ready to change or wouldn't allow for, and was a real need in the community. And I think for me, that grassroots piece is it is people doing things for people the way that people would do them. Um, and seeing the needs in their community as they really are, not what's next on the agenda, or what has political will, or what's going to win the next election, but like, sorry, we need this now, so we're going to go ahead and get out there and do it with our hands. And I think most of the stories in this book reflect that pretty well.
All right. For our next question, um, I believe we might have talked about this a little bit. How you define grassroots? We kind of all right. All right. What surprised you the most during the process of gathering stories from the contributors?
I have two kind of easy ones. They're a little bit glib. Sorry. How many people were doing stuff? Again, we tried to reach out beyond our immediate network and the immediate projects that we were uh, working on and touching in our own activist work. The amount of submissions that we got, the amount of interest that was shown, was staggering. I thought we would have I thought this would be a far shorter book. And the other is that I mentioned it a little bit earlier, the level of imposter syndrome, uh, uncertainty that what people were doing was having an effect or was worth talking about. So it was sort of two. It was like this amazing flooding of, oh my god, there is so much grassroots activism happening in this city, how amazing is this? And also there are so many people that are out there doing really hard work every day that don't see themselves as worth telling that story, or as worth like they're not really doing anything big, and that was sort of the measure. It's like, oh, it's not, I'm just doing this little thing, I just have this little whatever, and it's like, but you're creating real change. in a space that needs it, and so to kind of, I don't know, navigate those were the surprises that I had.
Um, for me, I think, and I don't know that this would have been the answer I would have given 10 years ago. I think rereading the book, my answers have evolved and changed a little bit. I think for me right now, what surprised me is that there's actually quite a lot of generational variation. It was something we thought very hard about. What would that look like? What did activism look like in the 80s versus what it looked like in 2016 when we were gathering submissions? Um, but also to hear people's stories around like what it meant to grow up in Grand Rapids a time before I was born. And that we were able to find people to tell those stories, and it wasn't my mom, right? Like, um, and that people were willing to do that. And I think for me, that was and is still really surprising that uh, that there was a reach beyond that. I think it's a story of point in time for sure, but that there were people that wanted to tell their stories in 2016 about the work that they were doing in 1980. And that I think was really exciting. I don't know. I don't have really. I wish I had better language to articulate what I mean by that, but it's still really fun to read the stories in here and hear what's been happening, right?
Okay, we're going to see if there's any questions in the audience before we go to more prepared questions. So you guys think about your questions and we'll continue. I have a question.
Fantastic.
So I'm wondering like what was left on the floor? So when you decided what would go in the book, do you have any regrets about what didn't go in the book, or did everything you collected did that go in the book?
That's a really good question. So, yes, and everything that got to a completed stage made it into the book. So I'll say that. What didn't wind up in the book were some authors who I think you alluded to it a couple times, really wanted to be a part of it, saw themselves as maybe having a story to tell, but really struggled to articulate it and get it together. And then there'd be a lot of, I have a little bit, but I'm not quite sure where I want to go. And so um, we worked with a lot of people to tell their stories in ways that felt authentic to them. And there were a handful of people who at the end were just like, I'm not there. So I think that is true. In terms of what's left on the floor, I think it's more, there wasn't like, I don't want to tell this story, so it didn't wind up in here, but more probably sections of people's essays that kind of veered off, right? So as you're writing something, you have to make choices, which is really, really hard. So for the authors to work with them and say, I know what you're trying to say right here, but it's not helping move the narrative along. So I think we can cut this section. And so I think those are the pieces that are actually got left on the editing floor.
Yeah. So I don't know how many of you all have read any parts of the book. So what you just said reminds me of the moped story.
Yeah.
Because it was long and intense. Like, I mean, long, and I'm like, wait a minute, what does this have to do with grassroots? But then it really got there.
Yeah.
And I was like, okay. But it was a long way around learning about moped culture, which I'm appreciative of now. But yeah, that
Very
one.
much. Yes. And there's a couple others too that like it was like, how do you tell the story? And so I think it's Tony, right? Remick, I think, is the author of that one. You know, so there are authors and storytellers. And this is the other part that I'll add to that. Some people had been professionally trained in writing, right? So there's journalists who were writing stories, many journalists, in fact, but also people who had never written or hadn't written an essay since they graduated from college, right? And they were like, I don't know what I'm doing. And so the variation was pretty immense in terms of where people were when they started. And you hadn't edited before, and I was a relative newbie for this style of editing. I'm an academic, right? So it's a different format. Yeah.
Thank you. Questions?
So one of the aspects of the book that I liked was it included things like poetry. It included different forms of writing. So can you talk about why that was important for you guys to include in the book?
Yeah. So because we were trying to create a platform for people to tell their stories, we were really careful not to tell them how to tell those stories, right? I will tell you that it makes editing a nightmare. But if the way that you tell the story of the way that you change the world is poetry instead of structured essay or a narrative instead of more educational, then that is the story of your activism and it needs to be expressed that way. Um, we tried to create a balance of that in the book. Um, Poetry is obviously shorter. We had some really long ones and some shorter ones, and we tried to balance the variety of storytelling and the variety of sort of writing styles. But it was important for us not to use the modern parlance for us not to gatekeep the method. Sometimes the meat is the message, the form is the function, right? You've got to tell some of these stories in the way that makes sense in the writing style, it's not just words on paper giving information. Does that make sense?
I'm wondering, yeah, I'm wondering how you went about figuring out who to draw from, because there is activism in Grand Rapids that goes back to, as Sophia can attest to, the women of the early 1900s, or the African American population in the mid 50s, 60s, 70s, the LGBTQ community, the migrant worker. There's just so many. So did you see activism as rebellion, or activism as progressivism, or activism as I did something different? And how far back did you reach in order to get that? Because it seems to me, with the number of uh, uh, retirement communities in the area, there's probably a lot of history to be drawn on there, and whether or not you were able to pull some of that in as well.
I want to go first. I have an answer. um. So so first, in terms of thinking about activism, not all the stories are explicitly activism. Some of them are about kind of figuring out who they were growing up in Grand Rapids, right? So there's definitely some of the what does it mean to be of this community? And to me, that's part of the figuring out who you are in community in order to do the kind of the civic work of community building and activism. Some of it is much more explicitly activism, and to that point, I think that is because of the world that we inhabited 10 years ago. And quite frankly, my own kind of professional academic interests in civic power building, urban democracy, and so on. In terms of thinking about historically, we reached out to communities and to individuals to help us tell the story, um, first broadly, right? A general call, which went out to it, which, because of the nature of the way that we were doing this, very much connected to our own networks. So there's definitely a bias in that direction. But also then trying to think like, where are the gaps and who do we invite? And we didn't go as far back as we definitely could, right? There are some pieces in the text that try to draw on some of that labor history, some of the kind of the historic components of Grand Rapids that are offer some kind of nuance to who we are. But the vast majority definitely are within that people who are doing the work the in 2015, right? So in terms of thinking about that, I honestly think about it more now. A lot of my own work has moved much more historical to think about like, what would that story look like, in terms of what would a book 10 years later that does more of that, the storytelling of people who have deep, longer histories that go beyond where we were able to go, what that would look like for sure.
I think too, because it was a snapshot in time of Grand Rapids grassroots activism in the moment, it was things that were existing and changing at the time we wrote the book. There's room for, there's I think a need for uh, both a longer historical understanding of activism in Grand Rapids and a living memory. There is a lot. We come from a feminist activist world, and like there is so much that went on here with suffrage and with prohibition and with all sorts of things that would be just fascinating to pull stories from. We're not historians, too, and so that's the other thing is that I think it was not so much making choices about what not to include as to it was to wrangle and make sense of what we got from the world at the time. Um, just in all honesty, like we didn't have to make a lot of decisions to cut things. It was really just trying to make it flow and understand it. I also think that, and as I've been rereading it too, it's been a different perspective, right? 10 years later, but the people in this book that were writing about more historical pieces are people who were still doing that particular type of activism when they wrote their submission in 2016. And so it really ties it to the longevity of these movements and the commitment that you have to make to see some of this change over 30, 40, 50 years. Um, yeah, and then also at the end of the day, it was like who we could find too, like very really. Mm.
So, is it on? Okay. So you mentioned that there were challenges in getting people to share their stories, especially like fear, hesitation, or feeling unqualified. So what does that tell us about whose voices are often missing in our communities?
And then I want you to do your thing. W- Putting this book together was for me like one of the things I learned doing it, one of the things that changed my view of how charity, nonprofit work, activism, etc., all of that works in West Michigan was the people that we talked to that would not share their stories because they were terrified that they would lose funding and support. And that fundamentally for me altered the way that I pictured the system here. I mean, you know it, you always kind of sense it, but people that had really good stories and were doing really good work, and quite frankly, like not even by the standards of the day that we wrote it, something that should be considered controversial or like super conflicting. Like, we had a friend of mine that was going to write a piece on homelessness and housing and would not contribute to it because her grant was threatened for the building of an LGBTQ homelessness and youth shelter if she wrote about that and the need for that publicly in the book. It was incredibly frustrating. It also shows that the bravery of, and this is way more Ashley's field, that the bravery of doing it isn't enough. The bravery of being able to talk about it is also like a second burden on people that are trying to talk about these stories, and that there are real consequences for that. And it changed the way that I approached storytelling in my professional life as well. Like, I think that I had been, like a lot of people in the nonprofit world specifically, um, really excited to give people the opportunity to tell their story without considering what I was asking, and the potential consequences of that. And it altered that for us. And I think that that was, for me, that was the part of the book that there are stories that could have been in here that weren't told because of the dominant narrative and dominant funders and sort of the status quo of the city, that it was unsafe to tell them, and they weren't ours to tell, right? So we really needed those people to tell them in their own words, and it just wasn't a safe space for them to do that.
I don't know how to follow on that. So in terms of the way that I think about storytelling, and whose voices are heard and whose voices aren't heard, um, I'll kind of emphasize that when I'm talking to people, and this is weird, but I do a lot of workshops on storytelling and public narrative for community groups now. So 10 years later, I now take the ideas that I really learned from here, and now I put them into practice in community organizations all over the place. And one of the things I talk about is storytelling is partly so powerful because you get to be the author of your own story. Nobody else gets to write your story for you. You have that power, and it's you get to claim that power. Um, but the challenge is when there's this idea of imposter syndrome. I don't have a story to tell. Who am I to tell a story? Um, that kind of that prompt to people, like, you get to be the author of your own story. And we're like, well, I don't even have a story to tell. Like, who wants to listen to me, right? And so there's a lot of working with people to feel like the work that they have done in communities, the work that they have done um, in partnership with other people, whether or not it quote unquote makes a significant change, is still part of the fabric of our community, right? It's still part of how we do this work together. And so when those stories aren't told, that though it is hard, right? It's hard to know that there are voices missing. There are historic voices missing, to the question earlier. There are voices missing that were very intentionally they were silenced. There were stories missing of people who wanted to do it or wanted to be a part of this originally, and then we're like, okay, I can't get myself there. And from a structural standpoint, there does become a timeline where we have to make choices about how we do this.
You actually have to write the thing and turn it in.
Yeah,
That's
yeah,
like
we did have a contract that said we had to submit
it is
it.
like a physical book that requires words, and that is like, it's a problem.
And so I think when reading this, I think we did what we set out to do, which was tell a different story than the dominant narrative that I had grown up with, that I knew existed, that when I left Michigan and moved to the East Coast and people talked about Michigan, that we did something different. We told a different story. But to your point, there are stories that are missing. And I think every story, every book is going to have something missing, and that we should always question where those silences are and why there are silences, right? Some of them are by choice. Some of them are because people have come to believe that they don't have a story to tell. Some of them are because they have been actively silenced, and that all of those are a part of the gaps.
I wanted to add one more thing to that because as you were talking, I thought of it. Is that the other thing here too is self-silencing from the community. So whose story takes precedence, and also silos, right? We reached out to our network. We used our networks, and we tried to get beyond them, right? We actively asked people, like, please, like, I know you. Who do you know? Who do they know? Like, really try to get beyond that. But Grand Rapids can be an incredibly segregated and siloed place for activism. I think a lot of places can, but like here, we worked in major, mostly feminist activism at that time, and that was a very particular type of feminist activism at that time too, right? Go third wave, and it was a moment in time in that space, but who were allies in that space, who was working together at the time, who did know each other, because there is a lot of isolation from activist communities, and there are spaces where it became really difficult. The networks hit a wall, There just weren't any branches that connected to this work being done over here from this work being done over here anymore. And I think that that's a problem. Like, I think it's a problem for the community, and I think it's a problem for being able to tell more complete stories in general.
All right. So now you just opened up a can of worms.
That's what I said. I was like, I'm gonna get you back.
I also want to name our positionality. So we keep saying that we were working in these kind of feminist grassroots spaces, but also as white women. And I was a white woman with a PhD at the time, right? So there is a very specific, who is this person, and am I going to trust her with my story to put it out there into the world in a way that I feel like my story will be authentic. Now, I think all the people that are in here, I probably know, if not closely, men like 50% of them, right? Like at least they know me as a human, and they could be like, I've met this person, I know this person. But there are a lot of untold stories in here, and probably in part because of who was putting it together. And I think that's also really matters, because we come from a very specific place. People are going to read my bio. They're going to make assumptions about who I am and the types of stories I want to tell. And so I think that also influenced for sure.
Okay. Any questions from the audience? Okay. I'm making my way over there. So as I make my way over, though, I have a question, and it may require a little thought. So, what would this book look like in 2027? And what stories would transfer over to 2027, and what will drop? So think about that one.
I just want to let you know I did appreciate your book, and just some of the stories from Grand Rapids and places that I remember growing up. And Sophia kind of took some of the questions that I was going to ask. But I wanted to know, from a lot of the people that you reached out to, did anyone reach back out to you after the book came out to just say, hey, I appreciated what you wrote, or just surprised at how it came out, and or any stories like that? And also, I was going to say, would you choose to do this again? And if so, what is it that you would do differently, um, if you had the chance?
Hold on, let me get him. We'll get him down, and we'll think this through. No, you're good. Uh, That's 2027. I'm gonna do the last thing first, and then back into it.
Okay.
Okay, cool. So to your middle question first. Yes, people reached back out. For most of the people in this book, they are not writers at all. And I mean, when we got it, it came out and the cover, and that was this whole process, is designing it and all of this stuff. But like, we got it and we're like, oh my God, it's real. Like, there's, it's a book. And most of the people in this book had that same experience. It happened today. Can I embarrass you, Angela? Yeah. So Angela's here, who was around for this book and a part of a lot of the things that are in it. And she was rereading it today because she is a really good friend. And she went, my name is in here. She was not one of the writers, but like, it really was exciting for people. I think that there was so much effort, and there was so much passion, and there was so much sincerity, and people really trying to write these things and then give them to us. And if you've ever done any projects like this, there is a long period of time between when you submit and when it comes into the world. And I think a lot of people had just sort of not forgotten that they'd done it, but was like, oh, that's a thing I did, I got it done, whatever. And when it came out and people were reading it, it was very exciting for the people in this book to be seen, to be heard, to have their name in print. It's cliche, but it was really exciting for a lot of them to have a place that they could reference, and they use it. These organizations went back and were able to say, look, we are in this. You can see our story here. There is a place for us to send you where you can learn more about us. And I thought that was really cool too. Do you want to comment on that part or go into the next thing? To the, what would it look like in 2027? Would you do it again? Would you do it differently? Would I edit an anthology about something with Ashley again? Yeah. Yeah. Would I do this book again? Not my turn. It's somebody else's turn. I would love, love, if anybody's looking for a project, to see somebody else write Grand Rapids Grassroots 10 years later, with their network and what is happening in the city now, and to see the differences and what movements are rising and active and telling their stories now, and maybe some of the ones that couldn't tell them when we did it get to now. I think that that would be fascinating. But I also feel very much like I at least made this thing at a point in time where it was my time to make this thing. And I would love it if somebody else stepped up and made their thing and continued the next literal and metaphorical chapter of it. If we had to do it again, if we had to, yeah, there's a lot that I would do differently. I would reach out to networks in different ways. I would be a lot more sensitive to what it takes to do that storytelling, like I said earlier, right? And really, I think I would encourage people in different ways than I did before. I did a lot of cheerleading on the first one. I think I would do a lot more listening the second time around. And I don't know. I feel like I would want, if it were me, I would probably tell slightly less stories, but let them go for longer. Because we saw the unedited versions, and I know what people had to make choices about what to tell, and I wish there was more of that in there.
I love that idea. I mean, it would be something we'd have to think through with the authors in terms of like what that means for them. Being somebody who has published anonymously, yeah, it can be incredibly powerful to tell your story even if it's not attached to your name. Yes, and attached to funding, very much so. In terms of yes, people reached out probably differently. So I'll say that I left Grand Rapids in 2011. Okay, I'm looking at my husband. Like, when did we leave? So we left Grand Rapids in 2011, and this book came out in 2017. So I had been gone for 6 years. I'm here often. I don't live that far away, but now, another 10 years later, my experience is going to be different in terms of what my relationship with the city looks like, because I have been gone for so long. And so I don't know what I mean, I love the idea in many ways. Hold on, let me gather my thoughts before I stumble through them ineffectively. I feel like I would love to be a contributor to somebody else writing the story and be able to talk about what it means to feel like I was a part of this space for so long and that it meant so much to me, but now to be apart from it, right? Like what that relationship, what watching a community from afar looks like and feels like. Because I joke all the time that when I'm coming here, I say I'm coming home. And when I leave here, I'm going home. Like both places are home. And then what does that mean when the community that raised you keeps evolving? And it's not the same as it was when I left. It is different. So I think how I would be involved, I don't know that I could write or be a part of this book anymore in quite the same way. But in terms of what I'd love to see, I think part of it is a broader network, right? So I think to your question earlier, telling more of the history and how people remember history and the stories that come from these places would be incredibly powerful. And then there are some people in here that have, right, like I think Mindy Yasasi is she a current city council member? Right. Like, so there are people that I'm like skimming through where I'm like, oh, they've gone on to do some really interesting things. I'd love to know that what that 10-year look like. So like kind of a personal retrospective sometimes. Yeah. I don't know.
Able the poet became the poet laureate at
Yes,
one point after
exactly.
that. So
Yeah.
yeah.
And Joel, I'll name drop. Like Joel Petrikis has gone on to win international awards for his filmmaking. Also wrote in here, right? Like there's like really cool people who were doing really cool things at the time who have continued to do really cool things, and I'm sure every single one of them. So if anybody's in the audience that I'm missing.
Any questions from the audience? Okay, so I'm going to pass the mic to.
We've covered a lot of our prepared questions in this more freestyle format, so I'm taking a look at what we have. I don't want to make a massive pivot, but it might have to be a bit of a pivot.
Totally fine. Go ahead.
I am very curious about this one. The book highlights tensions between development or gentrification, power, and community voices. How do you see those tensions playing out in Grand Rapids today?
It got worse. I was rereading some of those specific pieces this week, and I live here, and I've lived here the whole time. And it was embarrassing. Um, as a city, as a person who lives here, it really to look at there was work being done and recognition then and an understanding then of those tensions, of the gentrification, of the push and pull between development and place and tourism and community and all of those things. And it is, I will try not to get all the way up on my soapbox right now, but I have unfortunately seen it go in what is, in my opinion, the wrong direction. I feel like a lot of that got mowed over, and I feel like there are still amazing people doing that work and working on that work and really trying to ensure that it is not completely corporatized and that the city is still for the people who live here. But I drive every day by stadiums that have displaced schools and amphitheaters that have displaced rivers and buildings being torn down that people tried to save and couldn't. And I don't think that we have moved in the right direction as a city for the people who want to live here and to break down those walls of segregation and to break down those walls of gentrification. And it was Joel Petrikis, I think, who wrote in his essay, we were just reading it earlier, that like Grand Rapids is he had the choice to move to LA to be a filmmaker and said Grand Rapids is where I can live on a filmmaker's salary. I have a all-inclusive apartment for $400 a month, and I love my little space, and my gas bill's more than that now. Like, people can't we lost something, I think, in the affordability of this place, and it used to be nope, all the way up in the soapbox. Grand Rapids used to be on the list of most affordable places to live, and now it's on the whatever top 10 best cities to live in, and you're like, that's a really different thing. Um, it's a really different thing, and yeah, what we're doing to downtown and the way that it's developing and who it's developing for. Um, I don't know. I wish more of the work that was highlighting that then had won out, I guess.
I'm going to leave her answer because I have an academic answer that's not nearly as fun. But
Okay, any questions from the audience? Okay, next question.
So, sorry. So the project connects local history to a broader national narrative. Um, how do grassroots movements in Grand Rapids reflect movements happening across the country?
I'll to pick up this
Okay.
one. So one of the things that I think is really interesting about kind of connecting hyper local to national or even international movements or community spaces is that there's so many similarities from place to place, right? I've lived in Camden, New Jersey. I've lived in the outskirts of Washington, D.C. I've lived in various cities in Ohio. I've lived in Grand Rapids. In lots of different places, you can see the community uh, community activism. And you can see the ways that it's connected to other places of community activism. And you can see the ways in which it's influenced by state politics and national politics, right? All of that happens everywhere. But for me, I think one of the really powerful things is that there's so much history and context that shapes what that looks like in each individual location, right? So Grand Rapids is a vibrant city, right? With a lot of tension and conflict and complexity that is worth kind of pulling apart and understanding and why it happens. But it, so if I just was to like lay an academic theory on top of it, I'm like, yes, it does. We have all the things that everyone else has. But it's those nuances about kind of its history on the Grand River and as Furniture City, right? Like it's those ways in which communities were fractured with, the Polish on one side of the river and kind of Dutch immigrants on the other side of the river. It's the ways in which the Great Migration brought African American and Black families to this space to work in factories, and how that was experienced differently than it was in a place like Chicago or Detroit or Flint, right? That it looked different here because there was already a different history. And so how I came to kind of feminist activism was in part, I keep pointing at her. So like my mom's here, right? Yes, I'm in my mid 40s and my mom still comes to my events, right? And I, that was shaped very much by what that looked like in Grand Rapids. And how I stumbled across National Organization for Women was because there was an amazingly robust local chapter here, even though at the time, the national organization was struggling immensely to have local chapters. And yet we had a really robust kind of network that we had the opportunity to kind of build on and grow, and it's shaped into different ways. And so in terms of how Grand Rapids compares to these other places, we have all the things, it just looks different. And I think that's part of the kind of the amazing why telling the stories of local communities is so powerful, is that someone else from another place can pick up the book and say, oh, I see myself or I see my city in this story. But someone from Grand Rapids will be like, oh, I remember that street corner and I know exactly what they're talking about that protest on that street corner. And I remember that moment, or I remember that experience. And so I think, the both and kind of goes with that. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so I kind of have a question about I think my question is going to be, you kind of got into the anthropology of Grand Rapids, and we have had a presentation on that leading up to this program. But I want to kind of talk about the anthropology and the philanthropy, like thinking of activists who rely on the philanthropy of these big companies in Grand Rapids to fund them and calling that grassroots. So how do you navigate? I mean, so how is that grassroots, and how could that be navigated? So if you are part of one of these big organizations who's going in these communities and saying that they're going to upgrade the community, but that still is kind of like keeping a segment of people in their place, but they're building these new things in that place to keep them over there. How I'm especially interested in Dani, and I want her to get on a soapbox. Interested in what you think about those things. I don't even know if that was a full question or a full thought, but
It's about to be a full answer. My answers to those questions are probably the thing that has changed the most during my career, politically and nonprofit wise. I've had the chance to do and work with and interact with some just baller uh, and radical activists in Grand Rapids. Um, and I've had the chance to work with the very large corporate politically funded change. Very selfishly, I want to say that sometimes large nonprofit industrial complex organizations that are well funded can create positive change. There's potential there. And if they use their power correctly and they don't buy their own hype, they can be an advocate and a shield for the more radical activists that don't have access to those halls of power. But I see that very rarely. And most of the time, when I look back on my career, when I look back on the things that seemed like they were going to be really amazing, when you are dealing with large amounts of money, you are dealing with large amounts of wealth, you are dealing with large amounts of power, and it does not do for others very well. And when you are dealing with politicians, the higher up the scale you get, you are dealing with power and influence, and those things become the driving motivations and the charitable giving and the community engagement and the creation of projects that will help the community are a vehicle to show that money and power, not the use of it to create real change. And I we live in a hyper capitalist country, and there are things that require money. It is a necessary evil in this regard. But when when you feel that you cannot create change without it, when you are trying to do things that are uh, unable to be done without large amounts of money, I think you're dealing with a very different type of change. And we can talk grassroots, grass tops, watching Ashley's notes. Um, but at the end of the day, the stories in this book and most of the people I know who create change in the community that the community is really asking for are not doing it at the request of large funders and large donors. And even when those good things start that way, um, you said soapbox. 1 second. I'm going to ramble. Planned Parenthood is a great example. Excellent organization. I live in Bleed the Pink. Don't get me wrong. But when we started here in Michigan at the statewide level, we were 4 staff, and we were not connected to the national office. So our entire activist and organizing budget for the years of 2010 and 2011 was $35,000. That is what we had. We were scrappy and we had to find creative ways to do it, which means we had to rely on real people to do real things. And so people came and they made their own t-shirts, and we had a whole day doing that, and they got to put their own messages on those t-shirts, and they got to wear them to the Capitol, and people gave each other rides, and we had to organize ride shares. And so people were spending 3 hours in a car together, getting to know each other and getting whatever. You fast forward that 8 years, our activist budget was 2.7 million. So we bussed everybody in. And we wrapped those buses in giant pink logos, and we printed those shirts that everybody got the exact same one. In both of those cases, we were trying to influence legislation that we thought would help the reproductive justice movement move forward and to stop really bad things. The first way is a lot harder. The second way has pitfalls and dangers in it that I think not enough people are able to avoid the temptation of. And it creates conformity and commercialization And I remember having a conversation with Megan, who is one of the employees. She's been there the whole time, and she's just this amazing ball of energy that runs everything. Um, but listening to her, the first example I gave, her and I were running around to like office supply stores and Targets and 24-hour Myers trying to buy puffy paint, like in all the quantities we could get, right, to make these shirts the next day. And fast forward 8 years later, and she's sitting in a meeting saying, "I'm sorry, but we're not going to be able to host this rally on this day because the printer just can't deliver the shirts on time." You lose track of what you're trying to do.
There's so many things that I want to add to this. So while the next person goes, so you went in a different direction than where I was going to go with the answer to this, which is so in terms of thinking about questions of gentrification, kind of going back in that direction. I wrote an academic paper. You don't need to read it, but I wrote an academic paper that's called Villains, Saviors, and Allies, and it's about Grand Rapids, and it looks at specifically nonprofit development corporations and the narratives about these nonprofit developers throughout the city over a couple of decades. And it looks at newspaper articles and asks, like, what are the stories getting told through these different newspapers and these different venues around how we talk about these type of developers, and looking at different moments in time and changes. And what we did as a kind of thinking about that was then, well, how do nonprofit developers, these practitioners that are working in these spaces, what do they think of these narratives, right? Because they live it, right? If the dominant narrative coming out of these different newspapers include MLive, Grand Rapids Press, but Rapidian, Rapid Growth Media, like we looked at a variety of different media outlets. Like what do they think, right? And so much of what we heard from them when I was doing interviews was like, yeah, I have to navigate this, and I'm both, right? Like I'm both a practitioner in this nonprofit organization that has to kind of fit the mold of my grant and the requirements of my grant and the structures of the policies that allow me to do X, Y, and Z. But on the weekend, I'm also a community activist who's trying to make these things better. And so, part of it is that real people are often doing both, right? They're both community activists doing the work, working with their community organizations, but also working and trying to change these organizations from within, given the structures that they have. And I think there's a lot of really interesting, because one of the things I don't want to do is kind of create this false binary of there's the nonprofit industrial complex and then there's the grassroots, because I think the individuals move between these spaces, right? And that as people we are constantly navigating those moments, and I think that's part of what makes that story so challenging. And then part of it is to say that the way that we often talk about power is top down, right? The people that hold the money have the power. And I think there's a lot of part of what I like about this type of work is saying, well, you can claim power, right? You can claim spaces. You can change the narrative. And it might be slow, and you might not ever see the results that you thought you wanted to see, but you are a part of that change, and therefore you have the power. And I think both of those are really important for me as well, right? At the end of the day, everything is like not allowing the false binary to become the only way that we think about the world, right? Power doesn't only come from the top, it comes from all over. There's different ways we can leverage it, navigate it. And then the individuals, the people are moving between spaces and doing sometimes the disruptive work within organizations that we might not see for a very long time, right? Because the stories aren't being told, because they can't yet tell them. So, yeah. And I see you have a mic.
Yeah, long-time listener, second-time inquisitor. I'm listening to what you said previously, and Dani, you made mention of we're liberals, and I'm thinking about what Grand Rapids was 13 years ago when I arrived, and 10 years ago when you wrote it. Looks quite different in my mind now. Were there times when you may have approached somebody, or somebody was trying to find out whether this was an appropriate forum for them, that they were in touch with you and said, white feminist woman, you don't get me. You don't understand me. You don't understand my Grand Rapids. As opposed to, I guess, maybe what you would find now, 10 years, 13 years later.
Short answer is I didn't have anybody that was just like that ever expressly told me that. My assumption, given the work that I've done now for the last decade, is there were probably people who thought this isn't the place, this isn't the platform for me. Go ahead.
Yeah, I didn't have anyone personally with this book that seemed to be a reason for them to back away, because no one backed away. Nobody asked and then said, like, this isn't for me. Everybody who got to ask tried to do something. That being said, in outside of this book, constantly. One of my personally here as an activist in the space learning experiences is I worked when I was at Planned Parenthood. I was in charge of working with churches in the faith community here, and those two things had been oil and water historically, and learning how to have those conversations and to approach that differently. I was raised here, and I was raised with a very particular lens on the conservative community here and what they would be like and how that would be treated and how I would be treated and what I should expect and all of those things. And moving into a space where it was literally my job to bridge that gap, I learned a ton about navigating those conversations and how to approach people differently. But the city is segregated not only in geography and in housing and in racial and class issues, but also very, very much along there is a false binary here of conservative and liberal, where
100%.
you are one or you are the other, and that is not true. That is not true. I could sit and tell you stories of pro-choice and anti-choice and how that falls along spectrums and lines all day, just as one example. But like, we treat each other as though we are picking a team in this city far too often. And it is one of the first things that we announce to each other here as well. We put it right out front. That's not true everywhere else in the world. I didn't know that till I left here. Thought that was normal, by the way. So I think that I know that in my career and in my activist experience that has been a reason for a lack of connection, a lack of working together, whatever. For this book specifically, not explicitly.
Yeah.
Thank you. I want to join others in thanking you both for the book and for this conversation. I think so much of what's on my mind is context. I moved here right around the same time your book was published. So I spent time in Ohio, other places on the East Coast too. So it really helped me understand Grand Rapids. So what I'm thinking about, I had some idea when I moved here, others not so much. So no, it's helped me. And I think others, we always pass the book around to folks who are new just to share it. So thinking
I'm
about
blushing.
oh, really? It's great. And from what it's on my mind now really is, you began by saying, our students are reading the book in classes as part of this common reading initiative. What do you hope, knowing that they're likely bringing their own current context with them into it, what do you hope they're taking away from these conversations and from the book now?
Go start. Yeah.
I want them to write their own. Whether it's their own story, like write your own chapter of this book, or whether it is to get together and put together groups of their own stories that doesn't have to be a book, can be a zine, can be a whatever. But I would really like it if more people. I feel very much like we made an ask in the world and we got a group of people, but I would very much like it if other people made the ask and got their group of people and added to those stories. And I think that the act of storytelling, to Ashley's point, is incredibly powerful, but the act of getting people to tell their stories is also incredibly powerful. And if they don't get anything else out of it, And the further we get from the publication date, the that context is shifting, right? And there are people reading this book here at GRCC that were not born when I went to GRCC. Right? And so the further we get out from the publication, the more that context will change. It's great, very emotional moment for hearing that it helps you understand the city and made you like get a context for your new home here, because that's something I never it never occurred to me that this book would do for someone. So yeah.
Um, so I'm actually going to add this to the what would I do differently, because I think that um, the two are related in the way that I'm hearing them. One is that and I think it's part of my approach now, which is very much working in communities, working with communities, and here I was coming back to some place that was home, so it already felt like community. I didn't feel like I was dropping in, but it would be to do a little bit more of the working in groups, in teams, to do storytelling workshops and to help people think about what their story looked like over time. And so when I hear you say that people are picking this up, or that people are reading it in the classroom, where that pivots to me is that that's such an amazing opportunity for people to think about their own story and how that fits into Grand Rapids. And I think partly then offers an opportunity to even further complicate the story that we were telling, right? Is to say that there are, right, it was my brainchild was like, there is a different story to tell than the story that I keep hearing from the people outside of West Michigan, right? But there's even so much more. And so what would that look like to work with young people, or not just young people, but people who are in classes, right? So non-traditional students, to work with them and think about, like, what does the story look like? What is the story you want to tell? And is it the story of your grandmother, right? Who did X, Y, and Z and was a part of this community and part of that. And how do you help shape that in really powerful ways? And what does that look like at the end of the day? In addition to the anthology, for a very long time, I had a I feel almost embarrassed to say, I had a podcast, and it was Northeast Ohio based, right? So we would bring local community partners from throughout Northeast Ohio to come tell their stories. Like, what did this look like? And so in many ways, what we did here, I translated to my new home in Northeast Ohio in a different format. But it was still it's what got me through COVID, right? We did a podcast that I just listened to other people tell their stories about what community meant to them, edited it, and then put it out into the world. And I think that's just goodness. The fact that more than my mom and my dad have read it, more than Angie has read it, like, to me is just like profoundly amazing and exciting.
I saw it in a bookstore once and I lost my mind. I didn't know you could buy it like in the world.
People will send me pictures. They'll be like at the local community bookstore and they'll take a picture and send it to me. And I'm like, what? It lives in the world. It exists outside of.
All right, we are coming to an end. We're getting near to 1:30. We do have one more question, but first did want to say thank you again to the editors for coming here and having this discussion. Been a lot of very insightful things said. Um, Also do want to say we do have copies of the book back to the left if you're facing forward. And I believe our editors are willing to do some signings if you would like after. So for our final question, as we leave this conversation, what is one thing about activism or community engagement you hope we carry with us?
They gave us these questions. So the fact that I sit here and think about how I want to respond,
Yeah, but
it shouldn't take that much time. But
I'm thinking now, like, after the rest of the conversation. Like,
I'm going to go back to where we are social beings. And so I am a naturally shy person. And I think of myself as an introvert. But I still live in a world with other people. who help me make sense of my life, and I help them make sense of their life, and together we are capable of doing things together. And so we are individuals in a society. And so that there's power in seeing ourselves as kind of agents of our own story. We have the capacity to narrate our own lives. Like, we can do that individually, but there is so much power in the collective, and sharing that with other people and finding those similarities and also differences. I actually do a lot of dialogue work as well around dialogues across difference, and being able to hear one another and to understand somebody else's perspective from that collective. I think for me, that is at least a little bit of what we were trying to do with the book. And we call it an act of activism because simply putting it together was very much it was work, and it was working with other people to help them share their stories. And then how do you navigate, how do you put it together in a way that we do the individuals justice as a collective. And so that would be like, we have power individually, but we have even more power collectively.
Thank you.
For me, I think the answer to that question is there are a lot of labels and a lot of movements and a lot of issues. And certainly more than 10 years ago, everyone is inundated with those all the time. We are inundated with an incredible amount of things that demand our attention or request our action. And I think that it is very easy to get tangled up in what thing you are. I'm not an activist. Is this grassroots enough? I'm not the one. Someone should do something about this, right? And so for me, if I got to wave a magic wand and everybody who read this book came out of it with like a thing, right? They were just like, poof, if you've read the book, this will happen to you. Would be to do something. Do it. Like, get off your ass and do something. Not performatively, not a Facebook post. Get with people that you know. We're just two friends. It didn't have to be us that did this, but we were willing to do something with each other and perform labor in the world with each other and do work. And we could have spent that time just doing anything fun. And we did, but we also did this. And I think that that's something that gets lost in today's work. We separate things or we label them too much. And you can do activism and you can create change without having to be on something. It doesn't have to be your full identity. It doesn't have to be your full-time job. You don't have to be trained to do it. But I think that we get so afraid, and I see more and more fear and more silencing of people and more policing of each other. That's not a good enough idea. It's not the right way to do it. If you do that, the internet will lambaste you. You will get called this. It won't be whatever. That we don't act at all. And that gets nothing done.
Okay, so thank you all. I think that's it for today. Please, if you want your book signed, please come up to the front. Can we give the editors a nice round of applause? So we have our next phase of our Campus Coming Reading will start in May. So stay tuned to look for ways that we connect the Campus Coming Reading with what's going on in the city and nationally in regards to the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, the 112th year of GRCC, and the 175th year of Grand Rapids. So we're kind of tying all those things together, and we have a slew of programs that are going to be coming up. And so get involved, engaged, and do like Dani said, do something. Well, yeah. See, but I'm on the clock.
Real quick, thank you all for having us. This has been really exciting, and also we got to hang out, which we don't get to do very much anymore. So thank you for the opportunity, and happy to do book signings, but would you give us like 2 minutes to like use the bathroom and grab a cup of coffee and be right back? Okay.